The private jet cut through the low-hanging clouds over Oklahoma, and through the small window, Alan Jackson could see the golden fields stretching to the horizon. December had arrived early that year, painting the landscape in muted browns and yellows that reminded him of his childhood autumns. He pressed his palm against the cool glass, watching the familiar terrain unfold below like pages from a long-forgotten book. "We'll be landing in Tulsa in about 20 minutes, Mr. Jackson," called Captain Mitchell from the cockpit, his voice carrying the easy drawl that Alan had missed during his years touring the coasts. Alan nodded, though the pilot couldn't see him. 20 minutes. After 3 decades of international fame, sold-out stadiums, and Grammy Awards, he was finally coming back to Roosevelt Elementary School. Not as the superstar the world knew, but as little Alan Eugene Jackson, the shy kid who used to sit in the 3rd row of Mrs. Henderson's 3rd grade classroom, dreaming of something bigger than the small world he knew. His manager, Rebecca Martinez, looked up from her iPad, where she'd been reviewing the day's schedule. "The school's been preparing for weeks," she said, her voice carrying that efficient tone she used when everything was running perfectly. "Principal Williams says they've never had anything like this happen before. The local news stations will be there, of course, and your foundation's photographer wants to capture everything for the annual report." Alan shifted in his leather seat, suddenly feeling the weight of his starched shirt collar. "What about her? Mrs. Henderson? Is she still there?" Rebecca's expression softened slightly. She'd worked with Alan for over 15 years and had learned to recognize when the man behind the music was showing through. "She's still teaching, if you can believe it. 78 years old and won't retire. Principal Williams says she's been beside herself with excitement since we confirmed the visit." Through the window, Alan could see the sprawling suburbs of Tulsa coming into view. Somewhere down there, in a modest brick building surrounded by aging oak trees, was the classroom where everything had started, where Mrs. Dorothy Henderson had first encouraged him to write stories, to sing in the school talent show, to believe that a poor kid from rural Georgia who'd moved to Oklahoma could dream beyond his circumstances. The memory hit him like a physical force. 3rd grade, 1967. Standing nervously at the front of the class with his father's old guitar that was almost too big for his small hands. Mrs. Henderson had arranged for him to perform during their Friday afternoon sharing time, even though some of the other teachers had questioned whether country music was appropriate for an elementary school setting. "Go ahead, Alan," she had said, her voice warm with encouragement. "Let them hear what's in your heart." He had sung "Your Cheatin' Heart" by Hank Williams, his voice small but true, and when he finished, the silence in the room had been deafening. Then Mrs. Henderson had started clapping, slowly at first, then with growing enthusiasm, and soon the entire class had joined in. "That," she had said after the applause died down, "is what real music sounds like. It tells the truth." Now, 35 years later, Alan found himself gripping the armrest of his seat as the plane began its descent. Success had been good to him, better than good. The farm in Tennessee, the multiple houses, the ability to provide for his family in ways his own father never could have imagined. But success had also created distance, layers of people and obligations that sometimes made him feel like he was living someone else's life. "Sir?" Rebecca was looking at him with concern. "You seem nervous. It's going to be wonderful. The kids are so excited, and the media coverage will be great for the foundation." Alan managed a smile. "I'm not nervous about the kids or the cameras," he said quietly. "I'm nervous about seeing her again, about whether I've become the kind of man she'd be proud of." The plane touched down with a gentle bump, and Alan could see through the window that they'd rolled up a red carpet on the tarmac. A small crowd had gathered behind security barriers, Not the massive throngs he was used to at concerts, but a gathering of local officials, school board members, and what looked like several generations of families. Children held handmade signs that read, "Welcome home, Alan," and "We love you." As the engines wound down, Alan stood and straightened his jacket. He'd chosen to wear something simple today: dark jeans, a white button-down shirt, and his favorite boots. The same kind of outfit he might have worn to church as a kid, when his mother would make sure his hair was combed and his shirt was tucked in properly. "Ready?" Rebecca asked, gathering her materials. Alan took a deep breath, tasting the Oklahoma air that was already seeping into the cabin. "Ready as I'll ever be." The door opened, and the December wind swept in, carrying the scent of prairie grass and the faint smell of wood smoke from someone's fireplace. Alan stepped onto the stairs and was immediately struck by how different the air felt from Nashville, from Los Angeles, from any of the dozen cities he'd been in over the past month. This air had history in it, memories that made his chest tight with emotion he hadn't expected. Mayor Patricia Coleman stepped forward as he reached the bottom of the stairs, her smile warm and genuine. "Alan Jackson, welcome home to Tulsa," she said, extending her hand. "We are so honored to have you back." "The honor's mine, Mayor Coleman," Alan replied, meaning it more than the standard pleasantries usually allowed. "It's been too long." As they walked toward the waiting cars, a little girl broke free from the crowd and ran toward them, her mother chasing behind with an embarrassed expression. The security detail tensed, but Alan held up a hand to stop them. "Mr. Jackson," the girl called out, probably no more than 8 years old, with pigtails and a gap-toothed grin. "My grandma says you went to Roosevelt School just like me." Alan knelt down to her level, ignoring the cameras that immediately focused on the moment. "I sure did," he said. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Emma Claire Patterson," she said proudly. "I'm in Mrs. Henderson's class too. She told us all about you and how you used to sing songs for the class. She says you were shy, just like me." The mention of Mrs. Henderson's name sent a jolt through Alan's system. She was still there, still teaching, still making kids feel special about their dreams. "Mrs. Henderson is still your teacher?" Emma Claire nodded enthusiastically. "She's the best teacher in the whole world. She lets us write stories, and sometimes we get to read them out loud. She says everyone has a story inside them that's worth telling." Alan felt his throat tighten. That was exactly what she used to tell his class, word for word. Some things, apparently, didn't change. "Well, Emma Claire, you make sure you listen to Mrs. Henderson, okay? She's a very wise lady." "I will," Emma Claire promised solemnly. Then, in a whisper that somehow the cameras still caught, she added, "Are you going to sing for our class, like you did when you were little?" Alan glanced up at Rebecca, who was making notes on her iPad, then back at the earnest face of the little girl. "Would you like me to?" "Yes, please." "Then I'll see what I can do." Emma Claire's mother finally caught up, breathless and apologetic. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Jackson." "Emma Claire, what did I tell you about running off?" "It's perfectly fine," Alan assured her, standing up and gently patting Emma Claire's head. "She reminds me of myself at that age, curious and not afraid to go after what she wants." As they continued toward the cars, Alan found himself scanning the crowd for a familiar face, though he knew Mrs. Henderson would be at the school, probably putting the finishing touches on whatever she'd planned for his visit. The thought of seeing her again filled him with an anticipation that was equal parts excitement and terror. The drive through Tulsa was a journey through layers of memory. The city had grown, of course, but the bones of the place he remembered were still there. They passed the park where he'd played Little League baseball, the church where his family had attended services every Sunday, the neighborhood where they'd lived in a small rental house, with thin walls and big dreams. "The school's just ahead," Rebecca said, consulting her GPS. Principal Williams said they'll have a brief ceremony in the gymnasium first, then a tour of the facilities, and then— She paused, checking her notes. "Then you'll visit Mrs. Henderson's classroom." Alan nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Through the car window, he could see Roosevelt Elementary coming into view, and it was like stepping back in time. The same red brick building, the same tall windows, the same flagpole in the front yard, where he'd pledged allegiance every morning. Even the oak trees looked familiar, though they were taller now, their branches reaching toward a winter sky that threatened snow. Children pressed against the windows of the school, their faces bright with excitement. Teachers stood in doorways, many of them probably not much older than he'd been when he first walked through those halls. And somewhere inside, in a classroom that probably looked much the same as it had 40 years ago, Mrs. Henderson was waiting. As the car pulled into the circular drive, Alan closed his eyes for a moment and said a silent prayer. The same kind of prayer his mother had taught him to say before every big moment in his life. Not for success or recognition, but for the wisdom to honor the people who had helped shape him and the grace to remember where he came from. The car stopped, and Alan could hear the sound of children cheering from inside the building. In a few minutes, he would walk through those doors and back into the place where his dreams had first taken root. Back to Mrs. Henderson, and back to the part of himself that had never really left this small brick building in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Principal David Williams greeted Alan at the front entrance of Roosevelt Elementary with the kind of firm handshake that spoke of decades spent working with children and parents alike. He was a tall, lean man in his early 50s, with graying temples and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Mr. Jackson, this is truly an honor," Principal Williams said as they walked through the familiar double doors. "I've been principal here for 12 years, and I've heard stories about you from Mrs. Henderson since my first day. She talks about you like you were in her class yesterday." The moment Alan stepped into the main hallway, he was transported. The smell hit him first. That unique combination of floor wax, cafeteria food, and the indefinable scent of childhood that exists in every elementary school. The walls were covered with student artwork and achievement certificates, much like they had been when he was a student here. "We've tried to preserve as much of the original character of the building as possible," Principal Williams explained as they walked. "The school was built in 1955, and while we've updated the technology and made necessary renovations, the heart of the place remains the same." They passed classroom after classroom, each one filled with students whose faces were pressed against the glass doors, trying to catch a glimpse of their famous visitor. Alan waved to them, remembering how excited he would have been if a real celebrity had visited his school. "The gymnasium is just this way," Principal Williams said, guiding them down a corridor lined with trophy cases and photographs of past graduating classes. "We have about 400 students and staff gathered for the assembly. Nothing too formal. We thought you might like to say a few words, maybe answer some questions from the kids." As they approached the gymnasium doors, Alan could hear the buzz of excited voices from inside. Rebecca fell into step beside him, whispering last-minute details about timing and photo opportunities. But Alan found it hard to concentrate on logistics. Every step down this hallway was triggering memories. The water fountain where he'd bumped his tooth in second grade, the bulletin board where Mrs. Henderson had displayed his first story about his grandfather's farm, the corner where he'd sat during his first day of school, too shy to talk to anyone. "Before we go in," Principal Williams said, stopping just outside the gymnasium, "I wanted you to know that Mrs. Henderson specifically requested that she not be part of the assembly. She said she wanted to wait for you in her classroom, the way she used to wait for her students every morning." Alan felt a smile tug at the corner of his mouth. That was exactly like her. always thinking about the most meaningful way to do things, never concerned with fanfare or attention for herself. The gymnasium doors opened, and Alan was greeted by a roar of applause from what seemed like the entire school community. Children sat cross-legged on the polished floor in neat rows, while parents and teachers filled the bleachers. A banner hung from the ceiling that read, "Welcome home, Alan Jackson," in bright red letters. As Alan walked to the small podium that had been set up in the center of the gym, he caught sight of faces that looked familiar. Not specific people, but types of people he remembered from his childhood. The proud parents with cameras, the dedicated teachers shepherding their classes, the maintenance staff who kept everything running smoothly, the cafeteria workers who knew every child's name. "Good morning, Roosevelt Eagles," Principal Williams said into the microphone, using what was apparently the school's mascot. The children responded with enthusiasm that only elementary school students could muster. "This morning, we have a very special visitor," Principal Williams continued. "Someone who sat in these same classrooms, walked these same hallways, and learned from some of the same teachers who are still here today. Please give a warm Roosevelt welcome to Mr. Alan Jackson." The applause was thunderous, and Alan had to wait several moments for it to die down before he could speak. He looked out at the sea of young faces, all bright with curiosity and excitement, and felt the weight of responsibility that came with being someone's hero. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying easily across the gymnasium. "You know, I've performed in some pretty big places. Stadiums with 50,000 people, concert halls, even the Grand Ole Opry. But I don't think I've ever been more nervous than I am right now, standing in front of you all in the place where I went to school." A few children giggled, and Alan relaxed slightly. "I want to tell you a story," he continued, "about a little boy who was a lot like some of you. He was shy, he wasn't the best student, and he came from a family that didn't have very much money. But he had something that every single one of you has: dreams and teachers who believed in those dreams." Alan went on to tell them about his time at Roosevelt, about how Mrs. Henderson had encouraged his love of music and writing, about how the support of his teachers had given him the confidence to pursue his goals. He kept it simple, age-appropriate, but genuine. "The most important thing I learned here," he said, "wasn't math or science or even music. It was that everyone has something special inside them, something unique that they can share with the world. Your job is to find that special thing and then work as hard as you can to make it grow." When it came time for questions, hands shot up all across the gymnasium. A third grader asked if he still remembered how to write in cursive. A fifth grader wanted to know if being famous was scary. A kindergartner asked if he had any pets. But it was Emma Claire Patterson, the little girl from the airport, who asked the question that mattered most. "Mr. Jackson, are you going to visit Mrs. Henderson's classroom? She's been cleaning it every day this week and practicing what she wants to say to you." Alan's throat tightened at the image of Mrs. Henderson, now nearly 80 years old, preparing for his visit with the same care and attention she'd always brought to everything. "I absolutely am going to visit Mrs. Henderson's classroom," he said. "In fact, that's the part of today I'm most looking forward to." After a few more questions and a final round of applause, Alan was led out of the gymnasium for a brief tour of the school. They visited the music room, where a young teacher named Michael Foster showed him the instruments and told him about the school's choir program. They stopped by the library, where librarian Sarah Thompson had set up a display of books about music and dreams. But with each stop, Alan found himself growing more anxious about the main event, seeing Mrs. Henderson again. What would she look like after all these years? Would she remember him as clearly as he remembered her? Would she be proud of what he'd become, or disappointed that success had changed him? "Her classroom is just down this hall," Principal Williams said, as they made their final approach. Room 15, same room she's been in for 42 years. She started teaching here when she was 25 years old, fresh out of college. You were one of her first classes. They stopped outside a door marked with colorful paper letters that spelled out Mrs. Henderson's third grade. Through the small window in the door, Alan could see the familiar setup. Desks arranged in small groups, walls covered with student work, and at the front of the room, a reading corner with beanbags and bookshelves. She asked if she could have a few minutes alone with you first, Principal Williams said quietly. Before the cameras and the formal part of the visit. I hope that's all right. Alan nodded, not trusting his voice. Rebecca started to follow him, but he held up a hand. Give me a few minutes, he said softly. Please. He raised his hand to knock on the door, then stopped. Through the window, he could see her. Mrs. Dorothy Henderson, sitting at her desk with her hands folded, looking toward the door as if she'd been waiting for this moment for 40 years. Her hair was white now instead of the brown he remembered, and her face showed the lines that came with decades of caring for children, but her posture was the same, her presence unchanged. Alan took a deep breath, turned the handle, and stepped into the past. Mrs. Henderson rose from her desk the moment Alan entered the classroom, and for a heartbeat, they simply looked at each other across the room. She was smaller than he remembered, more fragile, but her eyes, those warm, intelligent brown eyes that had seen potential in a shy little boy, were exactly the same. Alan Eugene Jackson, she said, and her voice carried all the warmth and authority he remembered from childhood. Look at you, Mrs. Henderson, he managed. And suddenly, he wasn't a 50-year-old country music superstar anymore. He was 8 years old again, standing in front of her desk with a story he'd written about his dog, hoping she'd think it was good enough to read to the class. They moved toward each other simultaneously, meeting in the middle of the classroom in an embrace that felt like coming home. She barely reached his shoulder now, but her hug was firm and sure. The same kind of hug she'd given him on his last day of third grade when his family was moving away. I can't believe you're really here, she said, stepping back to look at him. I've followed your career, you know. I have every album, every magazine article. I've been so proud. Alan felt tears threatening and didn't try to stop them. I've thought about you so many times over the years, about this classroom, about the things you taught me. You changed my life, Mrs. Henderson. She waved a dismissive hand, the same gesture she'd always made when students tried to thank her for doing what she considered simply her job. You changed your own life, honey. I just provided a little encouragement along the way. They sat down in the reading corner, Alan folding his long frame into one of the small chairs, while Mrs. Henderson settled into her regular spot on the carpet, where she'd conducted countless story times. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the familiar space. Tell me about this room, Alan said, looking around. It feels exactly the same. Mrs. Henderson smiled. I suppose it is, in all the ways that matter. Different children every year, but the same hopes, the same dreams, the same need for someone to believe in them. That bulletin board over there, that's where I hung your first story, the one about your grandfather's farm in Georgia. Alan followed her gaze to a bulletin board now covered with current student work. I remember that story. You made me read it out loud to the class, and I was terrified. You were terrified, but you did it anyway. That's when I knew you had something special. Not just talent, but courage. The willingness to be vulnerable, to share what was in your heart, even when it scared you. I still get scared, Alan admitted. Every time I go on stage, every time I write a new song, the fear never goes away. Good, Mrs. Henderson said firmly. Fear means it matters to you. The day you stop being scared is the day you stop growing." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in memories. The classroom felt suspended in time, a pocket of the past preserved in the present. Alan could almost hear the voices of his long-ago classmates, could almost see his 8-year-old self sitting at one of these desks, dreaming of something bigger than his small world. "You know," Mrs. Henderson said quietly, "I kept something. Something I probably should have given back to you years ago." She stood and walked to her desk, opening the bottom drawer. From it, she pulled out a small notebook with a worn blue cover. Alan's heart stopped as he recognized it. His journal from 3rd grade, where he'd written stories and song lyrics and dreams. "Mrs. Henderson, you kept that all these years?" "I told myself I was keeping it in case you ever came back for it," she said, holding the notebook carefully. "But really, I kept it because it reminded me why I became a teacher. Listen to this." She opened the notebook to a page near the middle and began to read in her clear teacher's voice. "Someday, I want to write songs that make people feel less alone. My daddy says music is just noise, but Mrs. Henderson says it's another way to tell stories. I want to tell stories that help people remember the good things in life, even when times are hard." Alan closed his eyes, remembering the day he'd written those words. It had been after his parents had a particularly bad fight, and he'd come to school upset and confused. Mrs. Henderson had given him extra time in the writing center, encouraging him to put his feelings on paper. "You were 8 years old when you wrote that," she said softly. 8 years old, and you already knew what your purpose was going to be. Do you remember what I told you that day? You said," Alan's voice caught, "you said that anyone who wanted to help people feel less alone was going to do important work in the world. And you have." She closed the notebook and held it out to him. "This belongs to you now. You've earned it back." Alan took the notebook with hands that weren't quite steady. The cover was soft with age, and as he opened it, he could see his careful 3rd grade handwriting, the stories and songs and dreams of a little boy who had no idea what the future held. "I don't know what to say," he whispered. "You don't have to say anything," Mrs. Henderson replied. "But I do have something I want to ask you." "Anything? Would you sing something for me? Something you wrote? I know it might seem silly, an old woman asking for a private concert, but I've always wondered what it would be like to hear one of your songs in person, just the two of us, the way it used to be when you'd sing for the class." Alan looked around the empty classroom, at the bulletin boards and bookshelves and the corner where Mrs. Henderson had nurtured his love of music and words. Without a word, he stood and walked to the front of the room, to the spot where he'd stood 40 years ago with his father's too big guitar. "I wrote this song a few years ago," he said, "about going home, about the people who shaped us before we knew we needed shaping." He cleared his throat and began to sing, a cappella, his voice filling the small classroom with a warmth that seemed to bring the walls alive with memory. The song was called "Remember When," and it told the story of a man looking back on the moments that made him who he was. A teacher's encouragement, a parent's sacrifice, the small kindnesses that echo through a lifetime. As he sang, Mrs. Henderson closed her eyes and listened with the same focused attention she'd always given to her students' presentations. When he finished, the silence in the room was profound, heavy with emotion and connection. "That was beautiful," she said finally. "But more than that, it was true. You've never forgotten where you came from, have you?" "How could I?" Alan said, sitting back down. "This place, this classroom, you're part of everything I am." Mrs. Henderson stood and walked to the window, looking out at the playground where generations of children had played and dreamed and grown. "You know, I'm retiring at the end of this school year, Alan felt a jolt of surprise. Retiring? But this place won't be the same without you. Oh, it will be fine, she said with a smile. There are wonderful young teachers here, full of energy and new ideas. It's time for me to step aside and let them work their magic. What will you do? Travel, maybe. Visit my sister in California. Read all the books I never had time for. And maybe, she turned back to him with a twinkle in her eye, maybe write a book of my own, about teaching, about the privilege of watching children discover who they're meant to become. They talked for another hour, sharing stories and memories, catching up on the years that had passed between them. Mrs. Henderson told him about other students she'd taught, some who'd become doctors and lawyers and teachers themselves, others who'd found their calling in ways that might not make headlines, but were no less important. Alan told her about his family, his children, the way fatherhood had changed his perspective on everything. He talked about the foundation he'd started to support music education in schools, about his hope that other children would have the same opportunities he'd been given. As the afternoon sun began to fade, they both knew their time alone was coming to an end. Soon, the cameras would come in, the formal presentations would begin, and this private moment would become part of the public record. But for now, it was just a teacher and her former student, connected across the years by the invisible threads that bind hearts together. Mrs. Henderson, Alan said as they prepared to leave the reading corner, I want you to know that everything good I've done, every song I've written that's helped someone, every moment I've been able to bring joy to people, it all started here, with you believing in me. She took his hands in hers, her grip surprisingly strong. And I want you to know that teaching you, watching you discover your gifts, being part of your story, it's been one of the greatest privileges of my life. The door opened, and Rebecca appeared with Principal Williams and the photographer. I'm sorry to interrupt, Rebecca said, but we're ready for the formal presentation whenever you are. Alan and Mrs. Henderson exchanged a look that needed no words. They had shared what they needed to share, said what they needed to say. The rest was just ceremony. But as they prepared to let the world back into their reunion, Alan knew that this moment, this private recognition of the teacher who had seen his potential before he even knew he had any, would stay with him forever. It was the kind of moment that changes you, that reminds you of what really matters, that brings you home to yourself in the deepest possible way. The little boy, who had once stood nervously in front of this classroom with his father's guitar, had come full circle, and he was finally ready to share that journey with the world. The formal presentation that followed was everything Rebecca had planned it to be. Professional, heartwarming, and perfectly orchestrated for maximum impact. Camera crews from 3 local television stations captured every moment as Alan presented Mrs. Henderson with a check for $50,000 to support the school's music and arts programs. The local newspaper photographers snapped dozens of pictures that would grace the front page the next morning. But even as Alan smiled for the cameras and answered questions from reporters, his mind kept returning to the private moments he'd shared with Mrs. Henderson in the reading corner. The notebook she'd returned to him was tucked safely in his jacket pocket. Its presence, a constant reminder of the 8-year-old boy who had dreamed of making music that mattered. Mr. Jackson, asked Jennifer Walsh from Channel 8 News, what does it mean to you to be back at Roosevelt Elementary after all these years? Alan looked past the camera to where Mrs. Henderson stood with her 3rd grade class, watching the proceedings with quiet pride. It means everything, he said simply. This is where I learned that dreams aren't just something you have. They're something you work toward, with the help of people who believe in you before you believe in yourself. Principal Williams stepped forward to present Alan with a framed photograph of his original 3rd grade class, a black and white image that showed 25 8-year-olds arranged in 3 rows, with Mrs. Henderson standing behind them. Alan found his younger self in the back row, small for his age, with serious eyes and a tentative smile. Mrs. Henderson found this in the school archives. Principal Williams explained, "She thought you might like to have it." Alan studied the photograph, remembering each of his classmates. There was Tommy Martinez, who'd wanted to be a firefighter, Sarah Beth Collins, who'd been the best reader in the class, Michael Thompson, who'd shared his lunch with Alan whenever he'd forgotten his own. Children who had shared his world for one precious year, then scattered to the winds of their own destinies. "I wonder what happened to all of them," Alan said quietly. "Well," Mrs. Henderson said, stepping closer, "I can tell you about a few. Tommy did become a firefighter. He's a captain now with the Tulsa Fire Department. Sarah Beth is a librarian at the downtown branch. And Michael Thompson owns 3 restaurants here in town. They all stayed in Tulsa? Some did, some didn't. But they all took something from this classroom with them, just like you did. That's how it works. You plant seeds, and they grow wherever they're carried." As the formal ceremonies wound down, Emma Claire Patterson approached with her mother. She was carrying a handmade card decorated with glitter and stickers, and her expression was solemn with the importance of her mission. "Mr. Jackson," she said, holding out the card, "I made this for you. It's a thank you card, but also a promise." Alan knelt down to accept the card, opening it carefully. Inside, in careful 3rd-grade handwriting, Emma Claire had written, "Dear Mr. Jackson, thank you for showing me that dreams can come true if you work hard and have good teachers. I promise to listen to Mrs. Henderson and write stories, and maybe someday I will be famous too, but I will remember to come back and visit, just like you did. Love, Emma Claire." "This is the most beautiful card I've ever received," Alan told her, and he meant it. "Can I ask you something, Emma Claire?" She nodded eagerly. "What's your biggest dream right now?" Emma Claire glanced up at her mother, then back at Alan. "I want to write books that help kids who are sad feel better. Like you write songs that help grown-ups feel better." Alan exchanged a meaningful look with Mrs. Henderson, who was beaming with pride. "That's a wonderful dream," he said. "And you know what? I think you're going to achieve it. Because you have something very important." "What?" "You have Mrs. Henderson as your teacher. And that means you have someone who will help you discover just how amazing you can be." As the crowd began to disperse and the equipment was packed away, Alan found himself alone with Mrs. Henderson one more time. The winter sun was setting outside the classroom windows, casting long shadows across the floor where they'd shared their reunion. "What happens now?" Mrs. Henderson asked. "After today, I mean. How does this change things?" Alan considered the question carefully. "I think," he said slowly, "it reminds me what success really looks like. It's not about the number of records sold or awards won. It's about whether you've honored the people who helped you get where you are, and whether you've used your opportunities to help others reach their dreams too. And have you? Honored us? I hope so. I've tried to. But today makes me want to do more." He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. "Rebecca, I need you to set up a meeting with the foundation board. I want to create a scholarship program specifically for students at Roosevelt Elementary. Music and arts education, but also just general academic support for kids who might not otherwise have opportunities." Mrs. Henderson's eyes filled with tears. "Alan, that's not necessary." "Yes, it is," he said firmly. "You gave me a gift 40 years ago. You saw something in me and helped me see it too. I want to make sure other kids get that same gift." As they prepared to leave the classroom, Mrs. Henderson walked to her desk one more time. From the top drawer, she pulled out a small, leather-bound book. "This is my teacher's journal," she said. "I've kept one every year since I started teaching. Would you like to know what I wrote about you in March of 1967? Alan nodded, not trusting his voice. She opened the journal to a page marked with a faded ribbon and read, "Alan Jackson showed remarkable courage today during our talent sharing. His voice may be small, but his heart is enormous. He has a gift for connecting with people through music. And more importantly, he has the character to use that gift well. I predict this young man will touch many lives, and I hope someday he remembers that it all started with believing in himself." The words hung in the air between them, a prophecy fulfilled across 4 decades. Alan wiped his eyes, no longer caring who might see. "You wrote that about an 8-year-old boy? I wrote that about a young man who reminded me why I became a teacher in the first place," she corrected gently. "Sometimes you can just see it, Alan. The spark, the potential, the kindness that will make all the difference." Outside the classroom, they could hear the final sounds of cleanup, equipment being wheeled down hallways, voices calling goodbyes, the everyday rhythm of a school day ending. But inside room 15, time seemed suspended, holding space for one last precious moment between teacher and student. "Mrs. Henderson," Alan said, "I have something to ask you, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." She waited, her expression curious. "Next month, I'm receiving a humanitarian award from the Country Music Association. It's for the work our foundation has done in music education. Would you be my guest? Not just at the ceremony, but for the whole weekend. I'd like my family to meet you, and I'd like you to see what grew from the seeds you planted." Mrs. Henderson's hand flew to her chest. "Oh, Alan, I couldn't possibly. Nashville, and all those famous people, and—" "You absolutely could," he interrupted gently. "You're the reason I'm receiving that award. You should be there when I accept it. Please." She was quiet for a long moment, and Alan could see her weighing the invitation against her natural inclination toward privacy and modesty. "If I say yes," she said finally, "could I bring something to read at the ceremony? From my journal? About what it means to watch a student achieve their dreams? Mrs. Henderson, there's nothing I'd like more." As they finally prepared to leave the classroom, Alan took one last look around. Tomorrow, Mrs. Henderson would be back here with Emma Clare and her other students, continuing the work of nurturing young minds and hearts. The bulletin boards would be updated with new student work. New stories would be written. New dreams would take root. But tonight, this room would hold the echo of a reunion 40 years in the making. A circle completed, a promise fulfilled. "Thank you," Alan said as they reached the door. "For what?" "For seeing me before I could see myself. For believing in me before I learned how to believe. For showing me that success isn't about how far you go, but about remembering to come back." Mrs. Henderson turned off the lights, and they walked together down the familiar hallway toward the exit. Behind them, room 15 settled into evening quiet, ready to nurture the next generation of dreamers. 2 months later, Alan stood backstage at the Grand Ole Opry House in Nashville, adjusting his bow tie for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. The Country Music Association's humanitarian award ceremony was about to begin, and he was more nervous than he'd been for any performance in recent memory. "Stop fidgeting," his wife Denise said, with an affectionate smile, reaching up to straighten his collar. "You look perfect." "I'm not worried about how I look," Alan replied, peering through the curtain at the audience taking their seats. "I'm worried about whether she's really here." "She's here," Denise assured him. "I saw her with Rebecca 20 minutes ago. She looks beautiful, by the way, very elegant in that blue dress we sent her." Alan smiled, despite his nerves. When Mrs. Henderson had protested that she didn't have anything appropriate to wear to such a fancy event. Denise had insisted on arranging for a complete outfit, including shoes and a small evening bag. Mrs. Henderson had initially resisted, but eventually accepted, with the grace that characterized everything she did. The past 2 months had been a whirlwind of activity. True to his word, Alan had established the Henderson Roosevelt Scholarship Fund, endowing it with enough money to provide full educational support for 20 students each year. The first recipients had been selected just the week before, and Emma Claire Patterson was among them. But more than the financial commitments, the visit to Roosevelt Elementary had sparked something deeper in Alan. He'd begun writing again with a focus and passion he hadn't felt in years, drawing inspiration from the memories that had been stirred up by his reunion with Mrs. Henderson. 3 new songs had emerged from those sessions, all of them dealing with themes of gratitude, connection, and the invisible threads that bind us to our past. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the voice of the ceremony's host over the backstage speakers, "please welcome Country Music Association President Margaret Foster." Alan took a deep breath and made his way to the wings, where he could see the stage clearly. The Opry House was packed with the biggest names in country music, industry executives, and invited guests. Somewhere in that sea of faces was Mrs. Henderson, probably overwhelmed by the grandeur, but too polite to show it. Margaret Foster, a petite woman with silver hair and commanding presence, took the podium with the confidence of someone who'd spent decades in the music business. "Good evening, and welcome to the CMA's annual Humanitarian Awards ceremony," she began. "Tonight, we gather to honor those in our community who have used their platform and success to make a positive difference in the world. This year's recipient is a man who has sold over 75 million records worldwide, but whose greatest achievement may be the lives he's touched through his educational foundation and charitable work." Alan felt his palms growing sweaty as the introduction continued. He'd won plenty of awards over the years, but none had meant as much as this one would. "Before we present tonight's award," Margaret continued, "we have a very special guest who would like to share a few words. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mrs. Dorothy Henderson, a retired elementary school teacher from Tulsa, Oklahoma." The applause was warm and respectful as Mrs. Henderson made her way slowly to the podium. She moved with the careful dignity of her 78 years, but her back was straight, and her expression was confident. The blue dress Denise had chosen for her was perfect, elegant without being flashy, sophisticated without being intimidating. Alan watched from the wings as she adjusted the microphone and pulled out a pair of reading glasses. In her hand was the familiar leather-bound journal she'd shown him in her classroom. "Good evening," she said, her teacher's voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. "My name is Dorothy Henderson, and I have had the privilege of teaching elementary school for 43 years. In that time, I've worked with thousands of children, each one special, each one full of potential." She paused, looking out at the audience with the same calm confidence she'd shown in front of countless classrooms. "But tonight, I want to tell you about one particular student, a little boy who came into my 3rd grade classroom in 1967. He was shy, came from a family of modest means, and had dreams that seemed too big for his circumstances. His name was Alan Jackson." A ripple of affectionate laughter went through the audience, and Alan could see people turning to look for him in the wings. What made Alan special wasn't his musical talent, though that was certainly evident even then, Mrs. Henderson continued. What made him special was his heart, his genuine desire to use whatever gifts he had to help other people feel less alone in the world. She opened her journal and found the page she was looking for. "I wrote this in my teaching journal on March 15, 1967, after Alan performed for our class for the first time. This young man has something rare, the ability to touch hearts through music, and more importantly, the character to use that gift responsibly. I believe he will achieve great things, but I hope he never forgets that true success is measured not by what you achieve, but by how many people you lift up along the way. Mrs. Henderson looked up from her journal, her eyes finding Alan in the wings. Ladies and gentlemen, Alan Jackson never forgot. In the 40 years since he left my classroom, he has indeed achieved great things. But more importantly, he has remembered to come back, not just to visit an old teacher, but to ensure that other children have the same opportunities he was given. The audience burst into applause, and Alan felt tears pricking his eyes. This wasn't just an award presentation anymore. It was a testament to the power of teachers, the importance of remembering where you came from, and the responsibility that comes with success. The scholarship fund Alan has established at Roosevelt Elementary will support students for generations to come, Mrs. Henderson continued. But beyond the financial support, it represents something even more valuable, the understanding that we all have an obligation to pay forward the gifts we've been given. She closed her journal and looked directly at the camera that was broadcasting the ceremony. To any teachers watching tonight, I want you to know that what you do matters. You may never know which of your students will go on to change the world, but trust me, they're sitting in your classroom right now, waiting for someone to believe in them. The standing ovation that followed was spontaneous and sustained. Alan watched from the wings as the entire auditorium rose to their feet, applauding not just Mrs. Henderson's words, but everything she represented. The countless teachers who shape young lives with patience, wisdom, and love. When the applause finally died down, Margaret Foster returned to the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, the recipient of this year's CMA Humanitarian Award, Mr. Alan Jackson. Alan walked onto the stage, his emotions barely in check. He embraced Mrs. Henderson at the podium, the same hug they'd shared in her classroom, but now witnessed by millions of people watching the broadcast. As he accepted the Crystal Award from Margaret Foster, Alan thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. From a shy 8-year-old with big dreams to a man being honored for using his success to help others achieve their own dreams. "Thank you," he said into the microphone, his voice steady despite the emotion churning inside him. This award belongs to Mrs. Henderson and to every teacher who has ever seen potential in a child and taken the time to nurture it. He looked out at the audience, then back at Mrs. Henderson, who was dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. 2 months ago, I visited my old elementary school for the first time in 40 years. I thought I was going there to give something back, to share some of my success with the place that had helped shape me. But I learned that day that you can never really give back enough to the people who believed in you first. Alan paused, gathering his thoughts. Mrs. Henderson taught me that everyone has a story worth telling, and that music is just one way to tell those stories. But she also taught me something even more important, that success without gratitude is just noise, and that the highest honor any of us can achieve is to use our gifts in service of others. He held up the award, its crystal surface catching the stage lights. This belongs to every teacher who has ever stayed late to help a struggling student, every educator who has used their own money to buy supplies for their classroom, every person who has chosen to dedicate their life to nurturing young minds and hearts. The applause was thunderous, but Alan wasn't finished. Mrs. Henderson, would you join me up here? She shook her head modestly, but Alan insisted, gently taking her arm and guiding her to the center of the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, I want you to meet the woman who changed my life, not through grand gestures or dramatic interventions, but through the simple act of believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. He turned to face her directly. Mrs. Henderson, you once told me that everyone has something special inside them, something unique they can share with the world. Thank you for helping me find mine, and for showing me that the greatest gift we can give is to help others find theirs. As the ceremony concluded and they made their way backstage, Mrs. Henderson squeezed Alan's arm. "You know," she said with a smile, "I have something to confess. I always knew you'd be successful, but I never imagined you'd become this kind of man. The kind who remembers where he came from and uses his success to lift others up." "That's because I had a teacher who showed me what character looked like," Alan replied. "You didn't just teach me about music and writing, Mrs. Henderson. You taught me about being human." Later that evening, at the reception following the ceremony, Alan watched as Mrs. Henderson charmed everyone she met. Famous musicians, industry executives, and fellow educators who had traveled to Nashville for the event. She spoke with the same warmth and genuine interest she'd always shown her students, making each person feel important and valued. Emma Claire Patterson's mother had sent a video message that was played during the reception. In it, Emma Claire, now 9 years old and thriving in 4th grade, thanked Alan and Mrs. Henderson for showing her that dreams were worth pursuing. "I'm writing a book about a little girl who wants to be a teacher," Emma Claire said in the video, her gap-toothed grin bright on the screen. "And in my book, she meets a famous singer who tells her that the most important thing is to help other people believe in themselves." As the evening wound down, Alan and Mrs. Henderson found themselves on the balcony of the Opry House, looking out over the lights of Nashville. The March air was crisp but not cold, carrying the promise of spring. "What are you thinking about?" Alan asked. "I'm thinking about all the students I've taught over the years," Mrs. Henderson said quietly. "All the dreams I've witnessed, all the potential I've seen. Some of those students became doctors, some became teachers, some became parents who are raising the next generation with love and wisdom. And some became country music stars who use their success to help others." She smiled at him. "But you know what? They're all successes, Alan. Every single one of them who learned to believe in themselves, who found their passion and pursued it with integrity, they're all living proof that what we do in those classrooms matters." Alan nodded, understanding what she meant. Success wasn't measured in record sales or awards or fame. It was measured in lives touched, dreams encouraged, and the endless ripple effect of kindness and belief passed from one generation to the next. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, "what's your next dream? You're retiring from teaching, but you're not retiring from life. What do you want to do now?" She was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "I want to write that book I mentioned, about teaching, about the privilege of watching children discover who they're meant to become. And I want to travel, to see some of the places my students have told me about over the years." "And?" Alan prompted, sensing there was more. "And I want to help with your scholarship program. Not just the money part, but the mentoring. I want to work with the students who receive the scholarships, help them understand that the support comes not just with opportunity, but with responsibility." Alan grinned. "Mrs. Henderson, you never really retire from being a teacher, do you?" "Once a teacher, always a teacher," she confirmed with a laugh. "It's not what I do, Alan. It's who I am." As they prepared to go back inside, Mrs. Henderson reached into her small evening bag and pulled out a wrapped package. "I have something for you," she said. "A retirement gift, you might say." Alan opened the package carefully. Inside was a small framed photograph, his 3rd grade class picture, the same one Principal Williams had shown him, but this copy was clearly Mrs. Henderson's personal copy, worn from years of handling. "Look at the back," she instructed. Alan turned the frame over and found a handwritten note in Mrs. Henderson's familiar script. "To Alan, Thank you for proving that dreams do come true when they're built on character, kindness, and the willingness to remember where you came from. You will always be my favorite student, but don't tell the others. With love and pride, Mrs. Henderson. Mrs. Henderson, Alan began, but she held up a hand. That photograph has sat on my desk for 40 years, she said. Every year, when new students would ask about it, I'd tell them about the shy little boy in the back row who grew up to touch millions of lives with his music. You've been an inspiration to more children than you'll ever know, Alan. Not just through your songs, but through your example. As they walked back into the reception, Alan carried the photograph carefully, knowing it would occupy a place of honor in his home studio, where he wrote the songs that continued to tell the stories of ordinary people living extraordinary lives. The evening ended with Mrs. Henderson surrounded by a group of Nashville songwriters, sharing stories about the power of words and the responsibility that comes with the ability to touch hearts through art. Alan watched from across the room, marveling at how naturally she commanded respect and attention, how her wisdom about human nature translated seamlessly from the elementary classroom to the sophisticated world of country music. As they said their goodbyes and Mrs. Henderson prepared to return to Tulsa the next morning, Alan realized that this evening represented more than just an award ceremony. It was a completion of sorts, a circle that had begun in room 15 at Roosevelt Elementary and had somehow found its way to the stage of the Grand Ole Opry. But more than that, it was a beginning. The scholarship fund would continue long after both he and Mrs. Henderson were gone, ensuring that other children would have the opportunities he'd been given. The songs he would write, inspired by this renewed connection to his roots, would carry forward the lessons she'd taught him about character and service. And somewhere in Tulsa, in a classroom that looked much the same as it had 40 years ago, Emma Claire Patterson and her classmates were learning that dreams were worth pursuing, that everyone had a story worth telling, and that the highest achievement any of us could reach was to use our gifts in service of others. The shy 8-year-old boy, who had once stood nervously in front of Mrs. Henderson's classroom with his father's guitar, had finally come home. Not just to a place, but to an understanding of what success really meant. And in finding his way back to his roots, he had discovered that the most powerful songs weren't just about where you'd been or where you were going, but about remembering to honor the people who had helped you become who you were meant to be. As Alan Jackson walked out into the Nashville night, he carried with him not just a Crystal Award, but the knowledge that some gifts, like the belief of a dedicated teacher in a young student's potential, continue to give long after they're received. And the greatest gift he could give in return was to ensure that other children would receive that same precious gift of belief, hope, and unwavering support. The circle was complete, but the story would continue, one student, one dream, one believing heart at a time.